Ramana Maharshi once said so cryptically, that which does not exist in deep dreamless sleep is not real. So when we actually drop into the deep dreamless state, dreamless means formless, we're actually descending into the non-dual dimension of our very being. And so, these wisdom traditions say we actually have the whole thing upside down and backwards. If we are lucid to it, which is exactly what these practices can cultivate, we are more spiritually awake, more realized in the deep dreamless state than we are in the so-called waking state. And that alone is kind of a paradigm buster. That's no small thing. And these are the types of explorations that you can see for yourself if you just engage in the yogas.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Welcome back to the Sivana podcast. And wow, we have a mind-blowing episode in store today. Many of you know how much I love hacking yoga and meditation into every aspect of my life, stretching while doing the dishes, all that kind of thing. But I didn't realize that by just practicing yoga and meditation during the day, I was missing out on so much. Today, we're gonna learn about the nocturnal practices, lucid dreaming, dream yoga, sleep yoga, and what's called the darkness of the night with special guest expert Andrew Holecek. We're going to cover step by step how you can incorporate lucid dreaming into your spiritual practice and why you might want to. We're going to discover where dreams come from, how to interpret them, and how to create our own temple of sleep, and how this can make us more aware and happy even in our daily waking life. We touch on Tantra, sleep as preparation for death, and super practical tips on how to just get a better night's sleep. Speaking with us on all of this today is Andrew Holecek. He's completed the traditional 3-year Buddhist meditation retreat and offers seminars internationally on meditation, dream yoga, and the art of conscious dying. He's the author of The Power and the Pain, Preparing to Die, Meditation in the iGeneration, and his latest book, Dream Yoga, Illuminating Your Life Through Lucid Dreaming and the Tibetan Yogas of Sleep. He holds degrees in classical music, biology, and dental surgery. So Andrew, thank you so much for being with us and coming on the show. Looking at all of your work, I saw two things come up a lot. This idea of lucid dreaming and of nocturnal meditations. I want us to deep dive into both these terms. And I was curious, are these the same thing or are they different?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Brett. It's a real delight to spend some time with you. They're obviously deeply connected. Lucid dreaming, which we can definitely talk about, is actually part of a family of nocturnal practices, of which it's just the first. So we can talk about what the three remaining nocturnal practices are, at least the way I kind of classify them. In other words, there are four nocturnal meditations as I've come to understand them, of which the first and in many ways the most important is in fact lucid dreaming. It actually provides the platform upon which one can then dive into the other.
So before we go deeper, I mean, just this idea of nocturnal practices is, I think, so new for so many of us, even those of us who have a regular meditation practice. So can you tell us a little bit more where this came from? Is it mentioned in certain yogic texts? How did it get passed down?
Yeah, for sure. Well, it has a long and esteemed history in a number of ancient wisdom traditions. In Hinduism, they've talked about things like yoga nidra for thousands of years. Taoists have a dream yoga. But my particular area of expertise over the last 20-some years, 25 years, has been through the Tibetan Buddhist approach. Because for this tradition, the nocturnal practices have been around for thousands of years. And they have a very refined, sophisticated, elegant approach to working with mind in these subtle states. And here I think it's immediately worth interjecting that when we're talking about, for instance, dream yoga, which I'll get to in a minute, is the second of the four nocturnal practices. These yogas, these nocturnal yogas or practices, are an extension of the term yoga altogether. And I know you work a lot with so-called traditional yogic practice. But here, yoga has kind of a dual definition. One, a more colloquial expression would be yoga as in terms of stretching. In this case, it would be stretching conscious awareness into previously unconscious domains, attaining awareness in the dream state, attaining awareness in the deep dreamless state, which we can talk more about. And then yoga in a deeper kind of etymological or word origin sense, where, as you know, in this regard, it means to unite or to yoke. And in this regard, these nocturnal practices give us the opportunity every single night to yoke, to unite with deepest aspects of our being. And the final stages of the nocturnal practices, the nocturnal yogas, are in fact designed to do that, to really reunite you with your basic awakened nature. So yeah, they have a long history, and you know, it took on a lot of traction in the West when lucid dreaming was scientifically proven in the early 70s. So we can talk a little bit more about that and how they proved it and what all the benefits are. You know, it's a very rich field. There's so much to discuss.
And am I correct in understanding that your brain waves are actually different when you do this type of nocturnal practices? The brain waves are maybe different from when you would meditate during the day, and that's why some of this work is especially profound?
The principal reason it's especially profound is because you are working with what I sometimes refer to as the tectonic plates of your experience. You know, you're working with the kind of backstage mind, the subconscious mind, the unconscious mind. And as everybody since Freud can attest, you know, backstage always runs on stage. So what we do with our unconscious mind has a profound effect on what happens in so-called conscious reality. And in fact, Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, who's a highly esteemed master in Tibetan Buddhism, he mentions texts and reinforces these texts by going so far as to say that the meditations we can accomplish in the dream and sleep state are up to 9 times more transformative, because you're, again, mixing metaphors, you're working not just with the leaves or branches or even the trunk of your experience. When you're working with these nocturnal practices, because you're working with your unconscious mind, you're working with the very roots of your experience. And so what you transform down there, so to speak, has vast repercussions to what happens up here. And that's honestly a really important point, Brett, because a lot of people wonder, first of all, like, well, are these practices? And then secondly, well, why should I bother? You know, like my sleep and my sleeping state is so precious to me. You know, why should I concern myself with these practices? Well, once you start to understand the physical, psychological, and spiritual benefits behind these things, it really is kind of mind-blowing. It really, I'm in the midst of writing 3 books on it, one's published, 2 more are in the works. And the more research I do on it, the more I really think it's not an exaggeration to say that these nocturnal practices really could potentially represent the education or the pedagogy of the future. They have that much potential.
Well, this is super exciting because I know I love to hack yoga into every single part of my day, whether I'm doing dishes, you know, I'm stretching, or lots of meditation. But here now you're telling me this entire other half of my day, literally when I'm asleep, is an opportunity for me to be enhancing and potentially advancing my spiritual practice. So I think I have a good idea now of what these nocturnal practices are as like a category. Maybe now you want to walk us through some of the different things we can do or try at home, or the different techniques available out there for us.
Yeah, sure. But before I do that, let me just very briefly iterate the 4 nocturnal practices, and then I'll backfill, like, you know, some of the benefits. And again, you can just tell me how much you want to go into here and how far you want to go. But, you know, again, just very briefly, that the whole thing starts with lucid dreaming, which is when you wake up to the fact that you're dreaming while still maintaining the dream state. So you're fully conscious in the dream state, sometimes called a hybrid state of consciousness. And this has been scientifically proven. It's been, you know, going on for thousands of years in the Eastern traditions, and then really gaining some momentum in the West since the 70s. So with some proficiency in that, then that matures into dream yoga. And this is where it becomes more spiritual than psychological. So we could argue, or one could argue, that lucid dreaming is principally for a psychological benefit, which is enormous. But the dream yoga aspect of it becomes more spiritually oriented. And so there are specific stages of practice that we can talk about at length if you want, in terms of like, well, what do you do? What really differentiates dream yoga from lucid dreaming? And then so, again, to complete the picture, with some proficiency in that, one can actually maintain consciousness, believe it or not. And for most people, this is almost an unbelievable assertion, one can actually maintain awareness in deep dreamless sleep. And the great awakened masters, they never lose consciousness. They're always aware 24/7. And so through sleep yoga, you learn how to attain awareness in deep dreamless sleep. And so just to conclude, the final chapter is what's called Bardo yoga. This is almost exclusively a Tibetan contribution. And basically, this is when you use the darkness of the night to prepare for the darkness of death. And there's a vast literature associated with that. So now that we have that kind of schema out of the way, then in terms of lucid dreaming per se, and you can direct me here, but in terms of exactly how much you want to know, in terms of what one can do, it's really quite extraordinary. You can rehearse situations in a lucid dream. There's a vast literature that talks about all the incredible benefits where you can maintain lucidity in the dream state with such clarity that you can literally rehearse lectures. I'm a pianist, and believe it or not, I can sit in a lucid dream state and rehearse an entire piano composition within the context of my dream. And there are some very interesting videos. Your listeners can dig up some videos about German researchers who have shown how very talented lucid dreamers have learned how to play certain instruments, facilitated by their ability to practice while they're dreaming. So there's all kinds of things you can do in the dream state, rehearsing performances, lectures, athletic maneuvers, all kinds of things that can be done that are not just left in the domain of the dreaming mind, but then, and again, it gets a little bit more sophisticated here using what's everybody, I'm sure these days have heard of the basic principles of neuroplasticity, that what you do with your mind affects your brain. And so studies have shown that what you do in the dreaming state, and actually also through conscious imagery and visualization practice, can literally change your brain. So we're not talking just metaphysical woo-woo here. We're talking about hardcore data that shows that what you do in the dreaming state can literally alter the kind of strata of your brain. And it can also change the physical aspects. It can literally change your body, because what we do with our dream body affects our physical body. So for instance, if you have a dream orgasm, your physical body usually has a physical orgasm. So there is a deep connection between what we do in the dreaming state and the waking state.
Sounds like there's such a massive opportunity for growth here. And I'm sure so many of our listeners, and I know I myself several years ago played around with lucid dreaming. And I think I was told to get a journal and keep it by my bed. And I'm trying to remember, but I was told to visualize certain things before I fell asleep, and then, try to keep awareness even if I woke up from a dream. Do you want to walk us through maybe what your lucid dreaming practice looks like, or how you advise other people to sort of get started, like 101?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, again, and this is another really big topic, so I'll do my best. There's two ways to work with increasing lucidity. And I think it's also really important to toss in here, Brett, that when we're talking about lucidity is just another word for awareness. So a lucid dream is an aware dream. And right off the bat, whenever you're heightening or cultivating increased awareness, what doesn't improve with heightened awareness? And so the reason I mentioned that is one of the best ways to work with inducing lucidity, lucid dream induction, is to work with developing a heightened lucid relationship to your mind during the day. And this, of course, is where meditation comes into play. And countless studies have shown that meditators have more lucid dreams, and that, in fact, meditation masters, all their dreams are lucid. So what this suggests, and the reason I toss this in is because it shows us how it is that we have so many non-lucid dreams. And that is that we are, in fact, unwittingly trained in non-lucidity. It's like the poet Kabir once said, of death also applies to dream. What is found then is found now. So the reason we're non-lucid to our dreams is because we're non-lucid to the contents of our mind during the day. So the most foundational, what I call diurnal preparation for the nocturnal practices is in fact developing a more refined relationship to your mind through meditation. Because if you become more aware of the nature of your mind and the way it expresses itself during the day, you will naturally start to have more lucid dreams. So that's the first thing. Second thing is really believing in it. The power of belief cannot be overstated. I'm writing this material now that, where I explore the extraordinary powers of the placebo effect, which is really nothing more than the power of belief. And if you really believe in the power of lucid dreamings, it's what I call a super technique. That in itself has tremendous applicability in terms of inducing lucidity. And so these are the principal kind of daily practices. And then when you go to sleep, then there's a whole series of nocturnal preparatory practices you can do, some of which you mentioned, which is working with certain imagery. There's a deep connection, if you want to explore this, where the inner subtle body and the inner yoga is connected to that subtle body can be engaged. And there's really a lot to say here. So by working with some of the inner yogic practices, which support the subtle dreaming mind, the subtle dreaming mind is kind of supported by the subtle body. And so by engaging in the subtle body in these inner yogas, we can in fact learn how to trigger lucidity using that approach. One of the classic, for people that are listening that really want to have like the big bang effect, so to speak, probably the single best instruction would be to use what's called the wake and back to bed method. And this, again, has been proven by a number of researchers in the West to increase lucidity up to 2,000%. So that's a 20-fold increase. And I'll mention this and then we can come up for air and talk about anything. But this technique is incredibly simple. And what it is that you set your alarm to go off about 6 hours or so after you would go to sleep, or about 2 hours before you would normally wake up if you have an 8-hour sleeping regimen. And what happens is during the last 2 hours of the evening, you're in what's called primetime dream time. That's mostly when you're in REM sleep, which is when dreams occur, which is why we tend to remember most of our dreams just before we wake up. So with this technique, which I have used countless times, you set your alarm to wake you up about 2 hours before you normally wake up. You stay up for about 15 minutes to a half an hour. Don't go to your computer. Don't turn on any electronic gadgetry. Maybe work with settling your mind, reinstating the desire. The intention is another incredibly important ingredient to lucidity. Literally say to yourself as a mantra, I'm going to have lucid dreams. I'm going to have many dreams. I'm going to remember my dreams. And then basically allow yourself to fall back to sleep. And as simple as that sounds, this one technique alone, if I had to just send a reader or a listener home with one technique, it would be that. Wake up, stay up for about 15 minutes to half an hour, go to the bathroom, kind of reinstate your intention, allow yourself to drift back into sleep. And it's the likelihood of having a lucid dream with that technique alone is enormous. And again, there's so much to say here, Brett. There's I think one of the things I try to do with my own work is join the best of the East and the West. So I bring the wisdom methods from the Eastern traditions, and I can join them with the really high-powered techniques from the West, which these days there's all kinds of supplements you can take. There's electronic gadgetry you can use. So depending on where you want to go with this conversation, there's just a tremendous amount that people can actually do to trigger lucidity. And again, once they understand that lucidity is something, or non-lucidity is something that we're practicing all the time, once you understand that, then you start to gain a greater scope of understanding about what lucidity really means and how we can cultivate it. So anyway, a long-winded approach to bullet through a couple topics here.
No, I love it. I want to make sure I, and listeners too, understand. So when we're telling ourselves, I will remember my dreams, and, sort of indoctrinating our mindset into being open to this work, are we trying to ask ourselves to dream about something specific? Or we're just saying we just want to be aware in whatever dream is already happening? We're not like planting a seed to dream about a specific thing, or are we?
No, that's a great question. Good for you. So yeah, again, there's two ways to explore this domain. So generally what you say is exactly right. So what we're doing with lucidity, and this is what differentiates lucid dreaming from things like dream interpretation and the more psychological approaches, which, by the way, I am a huge fan of that. I don't disparage that at all. It's just that lucid dreaming goes a little bit deeper. So let me address that in two respects. So one is exactly what you said. You simply try to create a general intent to incubate lucidity altogether. And again, very simple. Tonight I'm going to have many dreams. I'm going to have good dreams. I'm going to remember my dreams. I'm going to wake up in my dreams, and really mean it. It's very powerful how intention can affect the mind in that regard. And so in terms of the second aspect that you mentioned, what you can do as a secondary practice, so for instance, this I think dovetails nicely into like what you would do with something like dream yoga, is that with dream yoga, once you attain lucidity in the dream, you don't just indulge your mind, you don't just fulfill your wildest fantasies, which is why lucid dreaming is kind of sexy and why it sells, because, it's like, fulfill your wildest fantasies in the sanctuary and the privacy of your own mind. Well, that's terrific. But, what those marketing gurus don't really put forth is that whenever intention is involved, even at the level of the dream, karma is created. So dreams are not karmically tax-free, believe it or not. So what you can do that dovetails into your second suggestion is that you can, in fact, set a specific intention in addition to the intention to become lucid. And this is called dream incubation. You can set a very specific intention. And this is what I do with my own dream practice, where I say, may I have these lucid dreams tonight for the purposes of doing, for instance, stage 4 of dream yoga. And so by doing that, it's like I'm adding octane to my intent. I'm adding a second level of intentionality. And then in so doing, you can, in fact, incubate or seed a dream. And this is a classic technique that goes back thousands of years through dozens of ancient wisdom traditions. And in so doing, you start to kind of seed your dreams. And this is how, in fact, I suggest people explore some of the more elegant stages of dream yoga. When you're actually engaging in lucidity for the purposes of spiritual awakening. So that's a great question.
And you use the example of stage 4 of dream yoga, but could it be something like to overcome my fear of this upcoming presentation, or it could be something specific and like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's exactly what you could do, so you can go to sleep and say, may I have, or, again, set this intention, this aspiration. I want to have a lucid dream tonight so that I can prepare for this presentation. And, it's really amazing. Again, this power of intent. It's like, and I'm sure we've all had this experience where you have to get up in the middle of the night to catch a plane or whatever. You don't have access to an alarm clock. And how often that power of intent serves to act as a kind of an internal alarm. And in exactly the same way, it may seem patronizingly simple, but again, it's this power of belief. If you believe in the power of intention and you really work with it, you can seed the dream state in exactly the way you're talking about. And what's really cool is with higher stages of proficiency, not only can you seed or incubate a dream for yourself, you can become what's called a surrogate dreamer, where you can do this for the benefit of others, where you can actually, if you develop some talents in this arena, and of course, in a certain sense, this is what shamans do and other mystics, you can actually create the ability to have dreams, surrogate dreaming, for the benefit of others. And that also expands the kind of scope behind this, helps with intentionality, helps to kind of supercharge the arena of the dream. And all these things, I think you'll start to see, but what they do is they kind of co-conspire to alter our relationship to the sacred and more refined dimensions of sleep. Because in a very real sense, we've all been evicted from the temple of sleep. In ancient traditions, they had a much more elegant, refined relationship to the dream state. And starting, unfortunately, with the Greek intellectual tradition and with some very influential Western church fathers, dreams were increasingly demonized, literally to the point where dreams were determined to come from the devil. And even today, when we say, well, it's just a dream, it's a pejorative or dismissive comment. So, and again, the reason I mention this is if we have a deeper, even historical understanding or even integral understanding of how we are so non-lucid, how did we get thrown out of the temple of sleep? We can serve to reconstruct this temple for ourselves every single night when we go to sleep, this kind of temple reconstruction project, the metaphor that I use, and reinstate a relationship to these wonderful subtle dimensions of mind that therefore allow them to become more available to us. And I guess the last thing I want to say here, and we can go anywhere with this, is that according to the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Hinduism and Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, we actually have it all backwards in the West. In other words, the waking state is actually the most restricted, dualistic, confined state of consciousness with the least potential for transformation. And so what this therefore implies, and these practices therefore invite, is that by becoming facile with lucidity, i.e. conscious awareness in the dream state, and let alone the deep dreamless state, these are states that are in a certain sense more real. It's like, Ramana Maharshi once said so cryptically, that which does not exist in deep dreamless sleep is not real. So when we actually drop into the deep dreamless state, dreamless means formless, we're actually descending into the non-dual dimension of our very being. And so, these wisdom traditions say we actually have the whole thing upside down and backwards. If we are lucid to it, which is exactly what these practices can cultivate, we are more spiritually awake, more realized in the deep dreamless state than we are in the so-called waking state. And that alone is kind of a paradigm buster. That's no small thing. And these are the types of explorations that you can see for yourself if you just engage in the yogas. So it's kind of cool.
Yes, I love what you're saying about non-dualism. I want to go back to this idea of, because I think I've had, and I'm imagining many listeners have had the experience where, you need to get up for that early flight and you set the intention, you need to get up early, and then you magically wake up, 5 minutes before your alarm. And the technique you taught us at the beginning, because I want to make sure we can tie it all together, is even for people who can't do that or aren't successful at that yet. You're saying to set an alarm 2 hours before when they'd normally get up anyway. And this is a very silly practical question, but I have to ask. So for you yourself, is that alarm maybe very gentle, or is it a bell? Or because I can imagine if it's that typical screaming alarm clock that might kind of jolt you out of your dream. Are there some techniques in the wake up process to help people stay aware?
You mean during that particular prime time dream period?
Yeah, during the prime time and during how to set an alarm to wake yourself up. Is there a certain technique or sound that works best?
Sure. Well, what you said is true. If you can set a gentle kind of alarm, and you can obviously, with all the different ringtones and whatnot on your phones these days, you can set almost any kind of new agey type of thing. That's great, because then you're aroused from your sleep in a more gentle way. It's not quite so jarring. And honestly, and this may seem somewhat silly, but really the only thing you have to do is just drink a little bit more fluid before you go to sleep. And then, nature's natural biorhythms will wake you up around that time. And as you go to the bathroom, you come back, very often you can start to refine your metabolism to the point. That's what I do now. That wakes me up about 6 hours into my sleep. And so that's a very natural way. And yeah, again, maybe that's all I can or need to say about that is that.
Yeah. And then once we're aware, we're just, say you're lucky enough or you practice and you catch yourself in a dream. You're I'm still dreaming and I'm aware.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to do anything? Do we just kind of enjoy the dream like a movie unfolding ahead of us? Or are we supposed to sort of take control of the narrative and try to enact or practice something? That was something I wanted to really make sure I got clear on from you.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So yes, initially what tends to happen is that when people become lucid in the dream, they're, first of all, they're so excited. They usually just want to indulge the dream. And there's nothing wrong with that. I did it for decades before I learned about things like dream yoga. So in kind of classic lucid dreaming, unless again, you're working to wake up in the dream to rehearse something or do some of these other kind of self-improvement practices of classic lucid dreaming, what most people do is just basically just have a grand old time. And that's okay up to a certain point. But for people like us and your listeners who may be interested in psychospiritual growth, there are limitations with lucid dreaming. And again, habits, i.e. karma, are created in a dream. This is why what you do in the dream can actually affect what happens during the waking state. So if you indulge your dreams, there are habitual or karmic repercussions to that. And so to extend on your question, so then what one does in either more advanced stages of lucid dreaming or in particular with dream yoga is then what you do is you wake up in the dream with a very specific intention to work with certain aspects of your mind as it's expressing itself in the dream. And this is an important interjection because when you're working with your dreams in dream yoga, what are you fundamentally doing? I mean, what is a dream made of? A dream is just your mind manifesting in this particular state, a more refined state. So you're really using the medium of the dream as a way to work with your mind. And so with that said, all of a sudden, there's a lot of potentiality here. And so what I do with my own presentations of this material is I articulate about 9 stages of dream yoga practice, going from rather straightforward to really quite sophisticated and refined, where you would work with transforming, for instance, one particular stage, just to give you a sense of what you might do. One stage would be to wake up in the dream state and to really just literally change that, like you mentioned, the narrative or the content of the dream. Quite literally changing a chair that might appear in the dream into a car, or a boat into a house, whatever. And then, your listeners might go, well, why do you want to do that? Well, once again, because what you're learning to do is you're quite literally learning how to change your mind within the context of a dream. And it's not as easy as you think. And so by gaining proficiency in that, you can then transpose, and again, it's this wonderful, what scientists refer to as bidirectional process. In other words, what you do in the dreaming state is it's not left down there. The insights are brought back up into the waking state. And so then what you do by gaining proficiency in this stage of dream yoga is you might discover, wow, my mind state during the day is not as solid as I once thought it was. So this anger that I'm feeling, I can now change into compassion. This jealousy that I'm feeling, I can now change into generosity. And so when you're working to change, flowers into trees in your dream state, there's a whole lot more going on than meets the untrained eye. It's what I call stealth help. You're actually learning how to change your mind at a more foundational level by realizing that the contents of your mind are not as solid as you make them out to be. And Brett, this is no small thing. I mean, I invite you and your listeners, we suffer in direct proportion to how solidly we take the contents of our mind. The big fancy word that's so important in the Buddhist tradition is to reify, or to reification, to make real. That's what defines a non-lucid dream. You take the contents of the dream to be real, and you suffer in direct proportion to how solid you make those experiences. And so by de-reifying, by seeing your dreaming state as more illusory, you then start to see your waking state as more illusory. You start to see the dreamlike nature of your own daily experience. And that's a big deal, because we are mostly the victims of our own machinations of how solidly we make our world, how we create the world in this kind of solid, reified image. And so by working with our dream state, it has very deep implications to how we can soften our relationship and see the more dreamlike, malleable nature of our waking state. And I'll end with this beautiful little jingle I'm sure you've heard, where it says, blessed are the flexible, for they are never bent out of shape. And so if we discover, again, this kind of colloquial expression of yoga, as we develop increased flexibility in relationship to the contents of our own mind, which is what these nocturnal practices do, using the medium of our dreams, it has immediate effect to how we relate to the contents of our experience during the day. And this is where it becomes a very deep spiritual practice, and how you can use waking up in the dream state to wake up in the spiritual sense. So I know that was a lot of information, but that gives you some sense, I believe, of how deep these practices can go.
One of my favorite things when I was studying Tantra and non-dualism was this idea that two opposite things can be true at the same time, and that's okay. And it seems like this is what you're talking about. Like in dreams, things don't make sense very often at all, but it's okay. And the more we get comfortable with that in the dream state, the more, as you say, we can be present to that in the waking state. And I think life becomes easier because we're more flexible and we see the nuances to things. And I just love that. The next question I wanted to ask you, just because I feel like we have to touch on this, I know I get asked all the time, and I'm sure you do too, is people have an experience with a really powerful dream that they remember, right? And maybe they don't usually remember their dreams. And there's two pieces there. They want to know, like, where did this come from? And what does it mean? So I'm curious to hear from you, like the first part, what do you think our dreams are made up of? Obviously it's our unconscious, right? But from an energetic perspective, could we see this as like energy, or like a scenario being channeled in the dream that needs to be released, kind of? Or is it sort of like our unconscious dark side, or something that needs to be worked out on a plane of consciousness that can't be, our day to day? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Another awesome question. Well, I have to say all the above. And this, again, boy, does this lead into some really cool stuff. So one of the things that these practices do, and then I'll be very specific in your question, is that they allow us to explore the dimension of our being at these really refined levels. And they help us really expand our sense of identity. And in so exploring the nature of mind as it expresses itself in the dream state, we start, in fact, to discover where it is that dreams do come from. And they come from different bandwidths of our identity. So, for instance, when you're having a kind of a nightmarish, traumatic, stressful kind of dream, those invariably come from kind of upper bandwidths of the unconscious mind, classical psychological domains where you can use, the dreaming state to work with psychological processes. And that's fairly, I think, easy for people to comprehend. But when you start talking about these really big deal transformative dreams, and the literature is replete with descriptions of these types of dreams. They're called dreams of clarity and then eventually clear light dreams. They have actually a very sophisticated kind of cartography or map of the mind that thereby elicits these types of dreams. And this is actually a really cool thing that you're bringing up here, Brett, because what this suggests is that, in fact, when we have these types of dreams, they can indeed be messages. It's like, back up to the more surface, it's like Freud once said, dreams are letters to ourselves. We can receive dreams from extraordinarily deep aspects of our being. And these are described in great elegance especially the Buddhist tradition. We can have dreams that come up from these deepest dimensions of our being that when they arise, we just know them. So it's exactly like you said, you wake up and you may not be able to put it into words, but you just know something special happened here. You just had a dream. In fact, I've had many of these because I have such allegiance to my dreaming mind that can change the trajectory, the course of your entire life. So there are, in fact, dreams. And the cool thing with these practices is you can, in fact, incubate, you can, in fact, cultivate these types of dreams. And I've done this extensively, especially in really long retreats, like when I'm in retreats for years on end, which I've done. You can actively cultivate these dreams to guide you. But for sensitive people, practitioners, yoga practitioners like your listeners, as we develop a more refined relationship to our bodies and our minds, we become more porous. We become more translucent and transparent to these deeper dimensions of our being. And this is why when people engage in spiritual practice, whether it's yoga or meditation, they invariably start to have these types of experiences, often mediated by the dream state, because they are in fact becoming more translucent to themselves. And they're inviting, whether they know it or not, porosity that allows these deeper aspects of their wisdom manifest. And these can literally, it's almost like having a near-death experience. You don't have to have a near-death experience over and over to have it change your entire life. One experience alone is enough because you are touching into something so foundational, so true. Again, it's this kind of tectonic plate thing that it shakes your entire life. And so that's the tremendous thrill of these types of practices, is that until we engage in them directly, we tend to have these experiences somewhat serendipitously. They just happen. It's great. It's beautiful. But why not understand what these experiences are? Why not understand where they come from? And then why not cultivate them so that we can have these types of dreams with increased regularity, where we can actually work with these really deep domains of the being, the kind of the divinity, the God within, that can then speak to us in these really beautiful ways. So yeah, again, lots to say here, but that's the really interesting thing about these practices, lucid dreaming, dream yoga, sleep yoga. Each one goes deeper, and each one allows you to experience these deeper bandwidths of your own unconscious and then eventually superconscious mind that then can manifest up in these, extraordinarily beautiful dreams. So anyway, great question. Appreciate it.
Well, what advice, I'm curious, do you give to folks who ask you, what did this dream mean, right? I'm sure you've seen, like, on the internet, you can, if you had a dream about an owl, you type in owl and it tells you owl means blah, 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 right? I'm assuming it's a lot more subtle than that. But for the person who's had a dream and they're like, wow, I feel really affected by this. I really want to understand it more. What are the next steps they could take? Is it to meditate on it? Is it to realize that it was all symbolic for something else? Was it to think that, it was just a part of my unconscious and, let it go? Just what's the best way for them to integrate?
Sure. Great. So yeah, first thing you do is you honor the dream. So, and you mentioned this earlier, so I'm going to come back to this. For people that are interested in these nocturnal practices, one of the best things you can do is start to journal. Create a journal, very specific. You're not going to write your, work ideas there. This is almost like a sacred journal you keep by the side of your bed. And when you have these types of dreams, you write them down, you date them. In fact, you often title them, and really, and you memorize them, you study them, you work with them. And then you start to work with this process of dream interpretation. And this is a huge topic. And there are a number of ways to do this. The kind of going to typing owl into Google and seeing what comes up, yeah, marginally helpful, because the owl for one person may not represent the same thing with another. So I don't put a lot of credibility in that, even though I, believe it or not, I do have a couple of dictionaries of dream symbolism just for the heck of it. And I can't dismiss them categorically because I think there is some truth. For instance, when you dream about water, it can suggest a sense of depth and that kind of thing. But what's more important, and this is where it ties into the work that you do, Brett, is to let your body interpret your dreams. And by this, what I mean is that I have found that one of the most elegant ways to work with dream interpretation is to reflect on the dream at a pre-verbal, almost intuitive level. In other words, you go over the dream, and very often people know this intuitively anyway. They wake up from a dream, and very often that first pre-verbal, pre-conceptual, pre-intellectual feeling tone of the dream, that's the most important message. You actually feel it in your body. And usually what happens is, that feeling tone may convey something we don't want to hear, because sometimes messages come from your dreams that may not be that particularly pleasant. And then, of course, the intellectual understanding mind comes in and tries to spin it and weave it into what, we want the dream to kind of determine. So I might recommend, there's a beautiful book by Eugene Gendlin, literally called Let Your Body Interpret Your Dream. And what he does, that I am such a fan of his way of dream interpretations, that most elegant I've ever seen, is he has a number of questions, something like 20 questions that you ask yourself of the dream, and then you simply pause in a kind of deep yogic way to see how it is that your body responds when you ask these questions. And then literally your body will help you interpret the dream. Because again, these dreams come from, we're talking about mind, but mind is supported by body. So when we're talking about the subtle mind in the dream, there's a subtle body that supports that. And so by working with this yogic application, even at the level of dream interpretation, and tuning into what your body says, how it responds when you ask these particular questions, that's when you get to the truth of the dream. That's when you have these aha moments that only you can interpret for yourself. And that's when the dream really has delivered its message. Because otherwise it's so super easy to spin off into some, psychobabble that basically distorts the dream into what your egoic conscious mind wants it to be. And so I think, in the briefest of nutshells, that's the way I work with it.
Beautiful. I have two last questions for you. So, and this has been so fun. I feel like we could talk for half a day. I definitely want to ask you about how you advise people best fall asleep, because I think everyone struggles with that. But let's save that for the end. While we're sort of in this deeper state, I wanted to just have you touch on briefly for us this fourth, I don't know if we want to call it this fourth pillar, that you said, the darkness of night, the darkness of death, like sort of the deepest place, because I think we want to hear from you on that. And when you were talking about it, it reminded me of, from the Yoga Sutras in the Kleshas, the clinging to bodily life. Abhinivesha, I think it's called, or Abhinivesha, yeah. And students often struggle with that when I teach yoga teacher training, or they're like, but I love my body. Of course I cling to bodily life, right? Death is scary. And I just was curious, I wanted you to touch on that piece for us just a little bit, because I think it's super interesting.
Oh, it's super interesting for sure. And again, I became, my original fascination with this material, Brett, was from the death and dying literature. I wrote this somewhat encyclopedic tome called Preparing to Die. And so, one of the reasons I got into dreaming to such an extent is that in the Tibetan tradition, which, perhaps one could state or could argue it's the most replete literature in terms of death and dying that I certainly have come across. They have their teachings on sleep yoga and dream yoga. Dream yoga and sleep yoga principally came about in the Tibetan tradition as a way to prepare for death. So, dream and death are deeply related. And in fact, there's so much to say here, but one can engage in, again, this is what's called Bardo yoga. Bardo, Tibetan word which means gap, very compelling word, basically refers to gaps in mind, gaps in consciousness. But of course, it largely talks about the gaps between lives, if you believe in that sort of thing. And so the way this works, and it gets very, very profound here, in my opinion, is that, and this is where we have to touch in ever so briefly with how deep sleep yoga develops into dream yoga. And I think you'll get some idea here. When we're working, so let's back up a little bit. So when we're working with the dream in dream yoga, we're working with mind as it manifests in form. I mean, mental formations, what we call dream images, arise. When that matures into sleep yoga, you work with formless awareness. You're working with the domain of your experience as it expresses itself in a formless way, which is parenthetically the main reason why most of us do not recognize deep dreamless sleep, because it's formless. There's nothing to see. There's no thing to see. But formless really formless means deathless. If something is formless, it's deathless. And so if one can develop a facility with dream yoga, let alone sleep yoga, with these subtle dimensions of mind and then these completely formless dimensions of mind, according to these spiritual traditions, which I have studied, and really my principal passion around these, Brett, has come from many, many years in solitary retreat where I've had these experiences, where you can attain states of meditation during the day, and in particular, obviously with sleep yoga at night, where you literally maintain awareness, you in quotation marks here, where you are aware of the formless, deathless domain of your own being. And this is a big deal. I mean, you can imagine, it eventually points to the death of death, that if you can maintain awareness as it expresses itself in these extremely subtle, refined, formless domains, which we fall into every single night. If you can maintain awareness there, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and countless other masters have said, you're going to be extremely well prepared for death. Because as we fall asleep, according to the Tibetans, it's what they call a concordant experience of the process of dying, which means it's extraordinarily similar to what happens when we die. When you fall into deep dreamless sleep, that's a concordant experience, according to the Tibetans, of what happens when you actually die. And so if you can maintain that awareness as you fall into sleep, these traditions assert that exact type of experience will be replicated when you die, and you will therefore have a tremendous ability to maintain awareness, i.e. lucidity, through the death process. And this is a really big deal, because what it means then is, instead of being buffeted around by the contents of our mind in the after-death state, just like we are buffeted around in a non-lucid dream, lucid dreaming, not only does it lead to lucid living, it leads to lucid dying. And so this is what I call graduate school. It's not for everybody. First of all, you have to believe in things like rebirth and, life after death, and that may not be for everybody. But for those who are interested in exploring these deepest domains, this kind of graduate school approach to dream yoga can completely prepare you for the experience of death. And in my own personal experience, I have no doubt about this whatsoever. The doctrinal support is there in the literature. And I get very excited when I talk about this, because it's a way for me to blend my passion with the darkness of death, with the passion of the darkness of the night, and realizing fundamentally they're not different. So anyway, in a nutshell, something like that.
It's beautiful. It makes perfect sense. I mean, it's like you're going to be more comfortable with it if it's something you've been practicing and sort of exercising a little bit. So I think that's really, really cool. So to end, I am sure I'm so inspired having spoken with you. I'm sure so many of the listeners are as well, but I'm sure a lot of them are also just really intimidated and are like, I find it so hard to just turn my mind off at night, right? Like it's still like working on, trying to get the cell phone out of the bedroom or not on the nightstand or whatever. Do you just have any quick tips you want to share or leave people with for how to wind down and fall asleep at night, especially if they want to try to start doing some of this work?
Yes, terrific. Yeah. So again, there's several ways to do this. And again, great question. So we go from the wildly esoteric, the Bardo sleep yoga thing, to the incredibly practical, immediate sleep hygiene issues. And this is big. So much to say about sleep disorders, 75 categorized types of sleep disorders. 70 million people in America alone suffer from them. Lack of sleep is now intimately connected with things like ADHD. Again, it's sleep. If you don't sleep, you die. It's a really important thing. If you don't sleep enough, you have all kinds of cognitive, physical, psychological problems. So even from a purely kind of medical point of view, and I work with this as well in my own clinical practice, sleep hygiene is a really important thing. And so let me say briefly a couple of things about this. It also, kind of backing up for a second and saying that there are two levels of sleep hygiene. There's classic psychological sleep hygiene, which I'll talk about, that anybody can do. And then there's more the spiritual sleep hygiene that maybe your listeners may have some interest in. But for classic, good old sleep hygiene, some simple tip. You want to pull yourself away, extract yourself from your electronic gadgetry at least an hour before you go to sleep. Some researchers now say 90 minutes, because the blue light of the computer kind of stimulates melatonin, which is, what's called the Dracula hormone that only comes out at night. It interferes with the release of that, so that can affect your sleep. So pull away from computers, keep your phones and stuff out of your bedroom. Some people may not want to hear this. Keep a lot electronic gadgetry out of your room. Keep the room cool. Something like 62 degrees is the ideal temperature, believe it or not. Keep it really dark. Avoid heavy foods before you go to sleep. Avoid, obviously, alcohol. Alcohol can help you fall asleep, but it has a kind of a deleterious rebound effect. It'll kick you back awake. And then there's this transitions now from these kind of physical parameters. Oh, yes, exactly. The other thing is association. The literature says you don't want to do a lot of work in your bed. You want to associate your bed with sleep and sex. So don't bring a lot of other junk into your room. Again, it's this idea of looking at your bedroom, and your bed is more sacred space. It's the idea of this temple of sleep. And I do this. I have a lot of restrictions about what's allowed in my bedroom, so that I have this space that when I enter into it, the environment alone becomes highly conducive to good sleep. So that's more kind of classic psychological approach. For your listeners and others, then, really helpful things to do are settling the mind, especially if you're engaging in these practices, settling your mind with some type of meditation, because as the mind falls asleep anyway, it's going to settle. If you can kind of unwind, and again, I'm sure you're aware of the inner yogic practices of the wind yogas. When you're unwinding as you fall asleep, you're unwinding. The pranas, the chi, the lung is actually moving from the head chakra, where it's principally associated during the day. Fundamentally, is going to drop into the heart chakra. And so you can unwind or unwind by engaging in standard mindfulness practices, and also somewhat connected to what you mentioned at the outset, visualizing like a lotus in your heart center, which helps the winds actually drop from your head into your heart. You can also what was I going to say? Oh, yes, you can do certain prana purification practices, which I'm sure you do in your work. Again, this connects gross and subtle body to gross and subtle mind, where in my tradition, we do what's called a ninefold purification practice, which is you exhale gently, but somewhat forcefully at the end. It's as if you're removing all the stale prana from every pore in your body before you go to sleep. I find that to be extremely helpful, especially if I'm engaging in dream yoga. And so, and if people have a relationship, my Kriya yoga instructor once many years ago talked to me about the Simha pose, which you may be familiar with. It's in the Kriya yoga tradition, and I'm not an expert in this arena, but he said this is a classic way to induce lucidity. And so by engaging in the Simha pose, which involved a type of exhalation process, he said, and he knew nothing about dream yoga when I heard this technique some 20 years ago. He said, yeah, in the Hindu tradition, this helps elicit lucid dreams. And so first time I did it, I had a lucid dream that night.
What about yoga nidra? Because I know a lot of people are, that's sort of like a gateway, and there's a lot of those. I even have yoga nidras on YouTube. Is that something that people could do before bed to fall asleep? And would it enhance this work if they wanted to go with it? Or is it maybe not an appropriate precursor?
No, totally. And again, it depends. The cool thing about these practices, just like with any other types of meditation, really, it's not a one-size-fits-all deal. And so like when you're parenthetically, when you're engaging in the induction techniques, of which there are dozens, the point isn't to master all these techniques. The point is to find one that works for you. And so if yoga nidra works for you, totally go for it. If the Simha pose works for you, use that. If the exhalate ninefold purification practices work for you, use that. So that's the cool thing about these practices. You learn that we're all different. Our body patterns are different, or mental patterns are different. And there are, again, it's not one size fits all here. You become your own meditation instructor with these practices, and nobody knows you, better than you. And so by engaging in these practices and the different induction methods, you start to see what does and doesn't work for you. So if yoga nidra works for you, this is deeply connected to sleep yoga in my tradition, then absolutely go for it. If a visualization stress, reduction visualization practice works for you, do that. I think really the most important thing, Brett, is for people to understand the basic mechanisms, what's really happening when you fall asleep with the gross and subtle body. And then, basically by understanding the larger frameworks, then you understand how these techniques may work. Because otherwise, they could very well work based on faith and just recommendations from teachers. But if you take the trouble yourself to understand what actually happens when the mind falls asleep, then you start to understand why these practices work, and you empower them through the very act of your understanding. So basically, whatever works, use it.
Right. And I think people could try a variety of techniques, but if they wanted to invite in the lucid dreaming, it's like in whatever technique they're doing, they sort of have in the back of the mind the invitation you talked about earlier, like telling themselves, I want to remember my dreams. I'm open to dreaming tonight, and all of that kind of inner talk about it.
Yes, exactly. So that's a really great point. So there are these basic, and I call them the super techniques. There are these basic kind of infrastructure things like intentionality, belief, meditation, these kind of basic Gestalt types of methods that are just, I think, baseline ground practices. And then within that, then they become more subtle, refined, sophisticated based on your own propensities and inclinations. And then the exploration becomes a really cool one. Then it's like, okay, instead of falling into sleep kind of stupidly every night, which unfortunately most of us do, you start to become a more curious, intrepid, inquisitive explorer of your mind and how it manifests as it goes to sleep and dream. And so that's the larger scope of these practices, is that yes, there are specific things to do with lucid dreaming, dream yoga, Bardo yoga, and sleep yoga for sure. But the larger domain to just alter your relationship to the darkness of your mind, which again, darkness is secret language for ignorance. I mean, darkness is code word for ignorance. And the image I like to use, and I think this may be a great way to close our wonderful conversation, is that one of the ways I look at these practices is it's a little bit like what happens when you step outside into the night sky from a really brightly lit room. And the brightly lit room represents obviously waking consciousness, and there's a whole lot to say here about things what are called wake centricity and how we're so aligned with the waking state, blah, blah, blah. But the idea is, the metaphor is, you step outside from a brightly lit room into the night sky, and you look up, and basically at first you can't see a thing. You're ironically blinded by the light because your pupils are so constricted, right? But if you just keep your eyes open in the dark, if you allow your pupils to relax and dilate, which is a wonderful metaphor for the openness and relaxation of spiritual practice altogether, and you just simply do that alone, sooner or later, you will start to see things that have always been there, but you've never seen before because you haven't been patient enough. You haven't kept your eyes open long enough. And so you keep your eyes open in the night. Eventually, thousands and thousands of stars become available to you. All these things that were previously in the dark now become visible to you. And in exactly the same way, that's the spirit of these nocturnal practices, is they allow you to open your inner eye, to look into dark domains of your experience that you've never looked at before, and start to see things that have always been there, but you just haven't looked. And this, of course, is a wonderful analogy for how looking within, you start to see these beautiful stars within you, the light within you. It's always been there, but we've just been looking in the wrong direction. We've been looking outside, and these practices allow us to look within and discover this vast universe that's waiting for our discovery every single night.
So beautiful. I do think that's the perfect note to end on. This has been such a great, great chat. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And I'd love it if you could now tell listeners how they can stay connected with you and find you online. And then I know you have a lot of books, and I'd love for you to tell us which one's the best one for us to start with if we want to go deeper with what we talked about today.
Great. Well, thanks, Barb. First of all, it's been a total delight to spend time with you. And again, thanks for the opportunity to plug my stuff. So obviously the best place to reach me is on my website, andrewholecek.com, Holecek. And I have a wonderful group of people that work with me on the site, and we list all my programs. And I offer a lot of little freebies. In fact, we have a free Lucid, my top 10 induction techniques are available free on my site. So that's obviously the best place to stay plugged in terms of what I'm doing. So thanks for that. And then, I have a number of books out. The last one, probably the most recent publication, is called Dream Yoga, Illuminating Your Life Through Lucid Dreaming and the Tibetan Yogas of Sleep. That's probably the best place to go. But that book in itself is the first of a trilogy, what I'm calling my Dream Trilogy. And the second book I'm about to send to my publisher now, that'll be out in about a year or two. That's on the daily practice of lucid dreaming, dream yoga, which is called The Practice of Illusory Form. And then the third book will be on a couple years. That's on what I'm tentatively entitling Recovering the Lost Temple of Sleep, which again is this idea of how we've been trained collectively, personally, societally into this thing called non-lucidity. So thanks for the opportunity, to plug my goods. That's probably the best way to learn about what I do.
Perfect. Well, I'll link up your website and book below. I definitely am going to check out the first one you mentioned. So I'm very excited about that. So thank you so much again for coming on. And listeners, let me know what you thought of this extra special Nocturnal episode. I would love to hear your feedback in the form of a review here on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. Just let us know how I'm doing, and if you found today's episode interesting, I would really, really appreciate it. You can also join the conversation on our private Facebook group, savannaheast.com/group. We'll redirect you there and let me know, are you going to try some of these techniques? Try lucid dreaming. I know my mind has been so expanded from today's episode. I think so many of us just think of sleep as a time to turn off our brain, and really there is so much gold here for us to explore. So I hope you have a beautiful day filled with yoga, meditation, and maybe some lucid dreams tonight. So much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannahEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.